2021, WSOU's Election Night Show won the New York Press Club Award for Metro political coverage. Now, Election Night is back this Super Tuesday at 8 p.m. for one of the most important dates on the political calendar. Tune in for live results and hear our analysts break down the 2024 presidential election cycle only on 89.5 FM WSOU.
Hello and welcome back to this coverage of WSOU Election Night coverage here on 89.5 FM WSOU. I'm Ryan Henry, joined alongside David Holtzman for our next topic of conversation. We are going to be talking about Donald Trump's criminal trials.
Welcome back, Ryan.
Welcome back indeed. There's a lot to unpack here. It's still even an ongoing process because the Stormy Daniels court situation, where if you're not familiar, it was in the early 2000s, I believe 2006. Donald Trump had one of his lawyers pay her hush money, and then they filed it as like business expenses. And that case is still going on. He's going back on trial in 20 days to deal with that dispute, and he's already dealt with a lot of criminal charges. He's been indicted on 4 different ones already. Before we break down each individual charges, David, what do you make of the general criminal trials? Because with everything that happens with Donald Trump's presidency, good and bad, it feels like everything's unprecedented. He is the first president to be criminally charged, and he's gotten charged for multiple counts.
There was a president in, I think it was the 1850s, who was charged with speeding. He was going too fast in his carriage. It might have been, the presidency was over. He was going a little too fast in his carriage. He was speeding. He got pulled over. He got pulled over again. On the second time, he was charged with speeding in his horse and buggy. The criminal charges are probably the most controversial elements of the 2024 election cycle. And that's no matter how you approach this thing. There's a political breakdown where there's so much argumentation, hatred even, maybe, vitriol between the two partisan sides over these political trials. So you have the questions, right? You have 2 big questions. Number 1, is Trump guilty of any of the things he's being charged with? Maybe. It's quite possible. Some might even say it's quite likely. And then number 2 is you have the question, are these charges politically motivated? Maybe. It's possible. Is it likely? So you have these controversial points coming from both sides. But let's get into the actual cases that Trump is being confronted with, he's being charged with, that he's being charged with over the last few months in this historic time period.
Yeah, and before we get deep into them, I want to say, he's already been indicted on a couple, so you have to say, is he actually guilty or not? But I think the politically charged ones, I think the one with the most evidence of it being politically motivated or charged is obviously the main one that has to do directly with the election, which was over down in
D.C.
In D.C., where he got where he got charged for trying to overturn the 2020 election. Obviously, we know the whole insurrection. What his actual role in that is a little murky, but that's probably the most politically motivated because, there's some people who say he did start incite an insurrection. Other people are saying that he was just having a speech, and there were other, protesters who had extra means of, trying to enforce the policy. I don't know if enforce the policy is what I want to say, but they had extra means on addition to what Donald Trump was trying to push. So I think that's probably the most politically charged. I think also what's been going down at Mar-a-Lago, where he's been, hoarding these classified documents. Some of them are politically based. So I think those are probably the 2 of the big 4 we're talking about that probably have to deal with Donald Trump as a politician.
Those are definitely the two strongest cases. The charges brought by Jack Smith in D.C., which include conspiracy against rights, that Trump conspired to take away the rights of the people to vote for the candidates of their choice, and the charges in Miami, in the Southern District of Florida, where Trump is charged with misusing classified documents, of holding a document in the air, talking with ordinary civilians, and saying, I could have declassified these, I didn't, but look at this. Kind of. So the irony of this is that the Florida charges are probably the strongest charges against him. But because it is South Florida and because the judge in the case is Aileen Cannon, who was appointed by Donald Trump, it's also quite possibly the suit that Trump is most likely to be acquitted of. And then D.C. is the opposite. It's beyond the scope of this analysis, but there are those. You can make the case that the D.C. charges were the weakest of any of the charges against him. But because the Washington, D.C. jury system, Washington, D.C. jury pool is so far to the left in a raid against President Trump, not one January 6th defendant has been acquitted. That is, acquitted entirely. D.C. is actually the place where Trump is most likely to be convicted.
No, yeah, and I mean, also kind of piggybacking on the D.C. talk, and I assume if the people who are discussing Nikki Haley, I believe it's Joe and Liam, Nikki Haley won the D.C. primary, and that's the only state she has won outright. So you're talking about a lot of personal biases maybe coming into effect there, like you said, because it's not like the Mar-a-Lago incident where this case is very strong. The Stormy Daniels case where it was put on file that they were paying this person off and they were federally charged. Donald Trump, nothing, you can't say it was directly related to him. There's an argument to be made, but it's not as, the evidence isn't as concrete as some of the other cases. But like you said, where where the case is being tried in, and in previous cases involving January 6th, it's probably the case that he might receive the harshest punishment on.
Right. Now, a prominent Democrat election lawyer, Mark Elias, he litigated the Bush v. Gore case. He tweeted yesterday, in a city of 700,000, that's D.C., Donald Trump got 676 votes in the GOP primary. Tough jury pool. So that's right. Trump does face an uphill battle, particularly in D.C. Now, that case is on hold at the moment. Trump's lawyers have appealed, and that went to the D.C. Court of Appeals, and they lost. And it was appealed from the D.C. Court of Appeals to the United States Supreme Court. Trump's lawyers argue that actually a president cannot be indicted for anything he did while in office, ranging from petty theft to murder. You couldn't actually indict a president at all. And the argument there is that the Constitution sets out a process for indicting a president, and that goes through Congress. And that's the impeachment and conviction process in the House and the Senate, respectively. So they argue that whether or not Trump tried to subvert the 2020 election, you couldn't actually even charge him with it. Now, is he going to win on that appeal? Probably not. It's a little bit of an out there argument. There's some logic to it, but it's a little bit of an out there argument. He's not going to appeal. He's not likely to win. But, and this is the key, is Trump's strategy with these trials is to push off the date of the trial as far as he possibly can in order so that the trial doesn't take place before the election. So the moment the election's over, Trump can just pardon himself.
No, yeah, and I mean, it's also like the argument that they're making about, well, one, a president can't be tried while in office. It's also kind of describing the murky lines of when he is technically, I guess, out of office, because it was during the inauguration of President Joe Biden when everything went down. Is it that the date, since Biden had already won the election and had already won so much, or had it already been, what, it's in November, about 2 months before, or is it Donald, he has not officially been sworn in, it's weird of the transfer of powers. I agree with you, it's a little murky, but at the end of the day, like you said, he's playing a time game here because it's March 5th, 2024, general elections in November. He's just trying to delay everything because, like you say, he's trying to get to November because if he wins president and it's in November, he can pardon himself.
Now, there's one state, and this is the trial with the most drama, right? We can hand out awards, right? Most likely to be convicted award, Washington, D.C. Strongest case award goes to Miami. Most drama award goes to Georgia. And that's the RICO charges that Trump was hit with. America's former mayor, Rudy Giuliani, was hit with. A number of Trump operatives were hit with, and they were hit with a RICO violation. And what a RICO violation is, it says basically we can't really find evidence of a crime, but we can find evidence of a conspiracy to commit a crime. And this was developed in order to take on the mob. And actually, Rudy Giuliani, as New York's Attorney General, he pioneered a lot of the legal scholarship around RICO cases. Now, in Georgia, if Trump were elected, he couldn't actually pardon himself because the president doesn't have the power to pardon state charges. In Georgia, actually, charges go not through the governor, Brian Kemp, a Republican who doesn't particularly like Trump. They go through a board of appeals. So Trump actually, if he's convicted there and he were elected president, he wouldn't be able to pardon his way out of a sentence.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting case. It's always funny because, like you said, a lot of it was involved in the RICO charges. And Rudy Giuliani, the man who I would say the kind of the forefather of all of it, like you said, was the one who the big thing was taking down the mob. He got suckered right in the mid. I guess it's the whole. I don't know if it's really an irony because is it ironic for a guy who wanted to take down organized crime to also be charged of organized crime? But it is very funny, like you said, to go down. And it is also very interesting because, as you mentioned, Trump can't pardon himself like he can with some of these other criminal charges. So it will be interesting to see how everything goes. But there's that charge, and then obviously the charge that has been making waves recently has been the two in New York City. You have the Stormy Daniels situation, which is still ongoing as well, and then he recently got charged in a civil lawsuit. New York Attorney General Letitia James sued Donald Trump and the Trump Organization about the assets, lying about the amount of assets he had. She also accused them of scheming and duping banks. There was the original ruling that Donald Trump could not operate businesses in New York. That got overturned. Now he can, but he still has to pay. It was the original settlement was
$454 million.
Yeah, $355 million. Now it's $454 million
plus interest.
Plus interest added on top of that as well. So very interesting how he's dealing with he's being attacked, not being attacked. He's being charged from all these different angles. And this has been the most recent just because, one, it deals with our area of the New York, New Jersey area, but also it's been the one that's been the most recently developing.
Right, and you mentioned those two cases in New York. The third case in New York was the E. Jean Carroll sexual assault defamation lawsuits. Now, he was acquitted of the sexual assault charge. He was convicted of the defamation charge in the E. Jean Carroll suit. She accused Trump of raping her in the dressing room of Bergdorf Goodman's at some point back in the 1990s. You got three cases coming out of New York. One thing I wonder is if we let all this play out in an alternate universe where Trump was never charged. He was never charged by Alvin Bragg in the Stormy Daniels case. He was never charged in the Southern District of Florida, not in D.C. Does Trump even run, or does he just retire? He's in his late 70s. He's not as old as Joe Biden, but if not for Joe Biden, he would still be the oldest man elected president ever. Does Trump kind of just want to sit on the beach in Mar-a-Lago and watch the sunset? And if he wasn't indicted, is that what would have happened?
I would have to say no. I think I agree with you I agree with the sentiment that I agree with your idea that he's trying to pardon himself, but I also think he enjoys being president. I don't think he wants to be president solely to pardon himself. It's definitely a factor. It could be maybe the main factor, but I think he has the love of the game outside of it, because none of these charges were active. I mean, people had known about the Stormy Daniels stuff had been known, before, but a lot of the new stuff had developed in the 2 years or so in between when he lost in 2020 and now. And
when Joe Biden took office.
Yes.
That 3-month stretch between November and January 21st.
Yeah.
When Joe Biden took office is when a lot of this stuff really came to the forefront. And then now Trump forced to defend himself. It's interesting to consider as maybe in an alternate history. Historians can go over this. So about the RICO case, something that came out in Atlanta, it just makes things more interesting. Trump was charged in Fulton County, that's Atlanta, by the DA, Fani Willis. She's now under investigation for ethics violations. Now, she hired to her team in order to prosecute Trump someone named Nathan Wade. And there's now a significant amount of evidence, some court testimony, cell phone records, indicating that the person she hired was someone that she was in a relationship with before she hired him. So, was she using and this is someone who then bought her tickets for vacations, for planes. She claims that she paid him back. But the court case has done a complete 180 and is bogged down with the discussion of, well, did Fani Willis commit ethics violations in charging Donald Trump? This goes with the slowdown strategy.
Yeah, it definitely does, and it adds to your validity of kind of just, trying to stall things out. Definitely is something that she, the Vance Williams is dealing with. And look, we don't know definitively what's the situation on that, but I want to transition a bit, still kind of sticking on the topic of Donald Trump being convicted, indicted.
Go for it.
Do you think we're talking about, it is so strange, and this is not what I want to talk about. It is so strange that a candidate who has been so polarizing in his now dating back to, I guess, when did you officially
2015. 2015, the escalator ride.
He first decides, so in his 9, which is kind of crazy to think about, his 9 years as a political figure, no one has been more polarizing. No one has been more polarizing than him.
Right.
He won the general election in 2016. He had the second highest voter turnout in 2020, losing to the guy who had the highest.
Right.
And now you have these criminal cases. A guy who's very polarizing in his own right, who, anyone you can ask to, if you ask a group of 100 Americans, I mean, mathematically, about 50 of them will say they love him, 50% will say they hate him. Maybe not the exact math. Maybe there's a couple in the middle who are ambivalent, but for the most part, either you love him or you hate him. It's so fascinating that a man who is so polarizing and is dealing with these criminal charges, these legitimate charges of, showing classified documents, of being involved with RICO, with, potential, with defamation, with business dealings, it really hasn't hurt his presidential case. He is dominating the Republican primary nominees. You could also maybe talk about how maybe the actual other candidates are very weak, which I know Anthony and Jorge did talk about, or maybe they also weren't ready. But it's fascinating how much he has dominated. He is dominating right now. Essentially, we already know who's going to be the president before the Super Tuesday, which wasn't even the case when he was running in 2016. That is, I think, the most fascinating thing about this.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of the magic of a democracy, I guess, for better, for worse, depending on where you're coming from, is that the people are going to choose, and that the ultimate court is the people's court. You have juries, and juries will say whether or not Trump is guilty or innocent of what he's being charged with. But in some sense, the larger court is the will of the people who can elect him, whether he's convicted or not. And just to send it to break after this, just a little bit of this of what's going on out there. It's 9:00. A number of additional states have closed. The rest of Texas closed. Colorado closed. Maybe another probably the third strongest state for Haley. Minnesota's closed, and a number of additional primaries were called. Virginia, Texas, Arkansas, Massachusetts, and Alabama. Most of those, Trump is up 50 or more. Now, in some of them, Virginia, Trump took it by 28, Massachusetts, 26. Maine and Arkansas, he's just a little bit below 50. Alabama, plus 64.
Yeah, I mean, it's a flat out boat race, and it's also, I think, another thing, and this is something that we will delve definitely more into when we talk about Joe Biden's presidency, because as much as we want this show and the conversation to be about the Republican primary and the Republican candidates, I think this is also a reflection on Joe Biden to a lesser extent, because let's go to your hypothetical universe once again. Joe Biden has not been, to be as objective as possible, he has not been the greatest president.
Right.
There are a lot of issues that have been wrong, that have gone wrong, international or domestically, internationally, economically, what have you. I think even with the exception of the strongest Joe Biden supporters, I think that is a statement, let's say 90% of Americans agree on.
Ryan, his approval rating's in the 30s.
His approval rating's in the 30s. Yes, it is very historically low. It's historically low. I think also the reason why Trump, and it's crazy because during all this, Trump's approval rating and his popularity has kind of maybe not reached the heights of what it was maybe 2016, but it's higher than it was in 2020. It's back and forth between him and Joe Biden, and he's higher in some states than Joe Biden, but it's very close. I think this just has to play a factor because, and maybe if you're going to your universe of whether or not he runs, let's say it's a candidate, or let's say if it was a candidate that was a very high approval rating, it was a very strong likely chance of him or her winning the winning once again. So let's say it was like Obama in 20. Well, I know he had some popularity, but he basically won pretty convincingly against Mitt Romney. Do you think he also runs? Then he's like, I got to deal with these court cases. The likelihood of me winning is very low. I'm very polarizing in and of itself. The person who I'm running against, very high approval rating. I'm going to focus on trying to save myself and not be in prison the day I die.
Biden. For Biden.
No, I'm saying for Trump. Sorry. I'm sorry.
For Trump.
I'm saying the reason why Donald Trump is still historically is still popular despite kind of the historical, the cases against him.
Sure.
But because of how bad Joe Biden has been, or how his disapproval rating, you said it's in the 30s, I'm wondering, this is a hypothetical I'll pose out to you maybe before we send to a break. If Joe Biden was, a candidate that had strong approval ratings, was going into this election, let's say in the 70s, like some of these other presidents we've seen in the past, do you think he runs because part of the reason why we're saying he's running is to pardon himself? Do you think if the odds were so stacked against him, he would just want to focus on trying to, I don't want to say legally get out of these cases because pardoning is part of our political system. It's part of our law system. But he's like, I'm going to try focus on winning these cases and focus on being these cases myself because I know I can't do it by winning the presidency.
It's interesting to think about. And this is one of those things that the historians are going to write about. Is if wars didn't start, if Russia didn't invade Ukraine, if Hamas didn't attack Israel, if international shipping wasn't disrupted, if inflation wasn't so high, would Trump even try? I think yes. I don't think Trump believes the numbers. I think if you tell Trump these are the odds you're going to win, he's going to pull a Han Solo and say, "Never tell me the odds, kid."
I mean, that's what they told him in 2016.
And look what happened.
Yeah. So,
then look at what happened in 2020. They told him the odds in 2020.
Yeah.
And he didn't believe he lost. I don't think he does data.
He doesn't, dude. I mean, he could be an old school guy, you know. He is in his 70s. I just thought it'd be very interesting because I think part of the reason why the Trump kind of polling is so fascinating is because the polarization we're seeing from the other side.
Certainly. Let's cue up a couple of songs. But what we got next, we're going to go exactly into what Ryan was just talking about. We're going to go into the pros and the cons of Biden's presidency. What do our analysts think of how he did? What was he strong on? What was he weak on? Were things that happened that people might blame him for, the wars, were they his fault? All of these topics and more are going to be discussed by our very own Liam Harding and Joe Morales, who are in studio ready to roll. You're listening to Super Tuesday coverage on 89.5 FM, WSOU. Keep it locked.